I'm a child health nurse in Broome.
And I'm helping our mob live longer and stronger in Sydney.
Giving them something to smile about in Alice Springs.
Opening their eyes to a brighter future on the Sunshine Coast.
Answering emergencies on Pearl Island.
You don't have to be a brain surgeon to work in health.
There are hundreds of different jobs.
Find the one for you at australia.gov.au/health-hero.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
My mum reckons there's nothing more important than education. What I reckon is, if I get a good education, I'm more likely to get a good job and do something I really love. And if I get a great education, who knows? At this stage, I don't really know what I want to be, but I really want the chance to be whatever that is.
The National Plan for School Improvement includes ongoing teacher training, a national curriculum, and funding based on student needs. The National Plan for School Improvement, Better Schools for Australia. To find out how the plan will help to give Australian kids a world-class education, visit the Better Schools website. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra. The whole community will benefit when we improve education. The National Plan for School Improvement.
You know, I've just about had enough of that. Government propaganda, Labor Party propaganda, flooding our TVs, every commercial break, non-stop. It's just been going for months now. It's intensified over the past few weeks, and you can bet your bottom dollar it's going to get worse as we move closer to the election. Hi, I'm John Moulis, and welcome to another one of my federal election talks. Now, the election is coming up, and the left are mobilising with their propaganda. It has been relentless on the TV and other media as well. If it's not government advertising, read political party, Labor Party advertising funded by the taxpayer. It's ads from the CFMEU telling us to spread it around, the mining boom. And the left have a lot of money. They have access to union funds. They have all of this money from donations and everything. And you can bet your bottom dollar that as the government gets behind in the polls, they will intensify this. We are going to see more and more of this propaganda flooding our TVs, telling us to keep Julia in the lodge. Now, I hope that the public won't fall for this. I hope that the public will see reason. They will know what has happened over the past, 5 years since 2007 under Labor governments. We've seen the economic crisis that the Labor government has brought us, the massive deficit, the massive debt. I mean, this debt that we've got to China, it's going to take at least 30 years to pay off that debt to China, and that is if the Labor Party doesn't get into government again. You know, if the Labor Party gets into government again sometime down the track, and they start spend all the time like they have been, you know, we will never get rid of this debt. You know, I mean, and the budget deficit. Now, the government told us that by this year, 2013, the budget would be in surplus. The fact is that we've got a record deficit at the moment, a record deficit far higher than anything we've had in our whole history. We've seen all these big spending programs. They're what's known as legacy programs, because the Labor Party, when they get in government, they have this obsession with creating a legacy, tying every future government down to their ideas and their programs. We saw it with the Whitlam government, with the original Medibank scheme, that they brought that big spending thing in. They had it in place and they thought that no future government would be able to get rid of it. The Fraser government did get rid of it, but the Hawke government came back and put it back in place as Medicare. And now we've seen things like the carbon tax. That came in, and the Greens demanded that it be made Abbott proof. They demanded that it be entrenched into Australia in such a way that it would be impossible to get rid of it. So what the government did, they brought in all of these extra bodies, interlinked with current government departments. They entered into contracts, some of these contracts more than 20 years, signed for more than 20 years, which will keep the carbon tax in place long after the Labor government goes. I mean, this whole clean energy future, this whole climate change thing is an absolute con. It is the biggest con we have ever seen in this country. And more about that later. But these legacy programs that the government brought in the budget, Gonski, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, all of those things which are going to be there, which a future Abbott government can't repeal, they can't get rid of, they're going to be there as legacy programs. And the Labor Party have this idea that they have to bring in programs like this, which people will remember them by, that 5 years down the track, 10 years down the track, people see these programs and they think of the Labor Party, they think of Labor. But the fact is that we can't afford these programs, and all of this, and a lot of people don't know it, it's just come onto the news the last day or so, that in this year's budget, there is a secret fund to set up a scheme whereby the administrative costs of political parties are paid for by the taxpayer. You know, we already have public funding of election campaigns now. The Hawke government brought that in the 1980s. It was an idea of Neville Rand's. Neville Rand brought it in New South Wales, public funding of election campaigns, because at that stage the Labor Party was broke. They had to dip into taxpayers' funds to finance their election campaigns, and so they brought in public funding of election campaigns. Now the Labor Party is broke again, and they want this scheme to finance every single aspect of a political party, administrative costs, everything, for $1 a vote they're talking about. So this could be $50 million for political parties. And don't think that the Liberals will get in and repeal this, because it benefits the Liberal Party as well. Because with public disclosure of donations, a lot of the small businessmen, a lot of the big businessmen who used to finance the Liberal Party, they're reluctant to finance the Liberals now, because you've got this public register of donations. They're afraid that they will alienate potential customers. They're afraid that Labor voting customers, Green voting customers will look at this register and see, you know, such and such a company on there, and they won't buy their products as a result. Because the left are like that. The left are very petty, they're very nasty people, and they're likely to do that. Whereas the Labor Party, of course, you know, their contributors are unions and all these people on the left, and so that's, people see that and they see fairly innocuous, you know. So this public disclosure of donations was brought in by the Labor government, the Hawke government, in order to try and stop large donations going to the Liberal Party. Simple as that. It wasn't because of any more altruistic aims. They did that to destroy their opponents. And the fact is that the Labor Party, they cry poor at the moment, but the fact is that their union mates they run superannuation schemes which have billions of dollars in them, and the left can finance their campaigns accessing this money. That's money that hard-working Australians have put aside into these super funds, and because of massive advertising by these super funds, they're called industry super funds, but don't be fooled by the name. They are union superannuation funds. They've got these billions of dollars which can finance their propaganda. Now the Labor Party, they can access that as well. So don't listen to them when they try and cry poor. You know, poor little us poor little battlers up against the ruling classes and the, you know, big business and all of that. That's just garbage, you know. So anyway, we can look at all of this. I mean, the Labor Party is rotten. They are stinking to the core. I mean, the smell of death is just coming off them, and you can see it. I mean, you can smell it, just about. It reminds me of what the New South Wales Labor government was like, and the Queensland Labor government was like in the couple of years leading up to the election. You know, where people had made up their minds already that they wanted Labor to go. They wanted to get rid of Labor. They'd already made up their minds, and the Labor Party were just involved in scandal after scandal, corruption, everything like that. And the public just had to wait until the predetermined election date to get rid of them. You know, we saw it in New South Wales, we saw it in Queensland, and now we're seeing it federally. People have made up their minds. They don't want this government. They don't want independence anymore. They don't want the Greens anymore. They don't want Labor anymore. They don't want the left. That this country and society in general has moved sharply to the right, to the hard right, and we want a hardline right-wing government. Well, I shouldn't use that term because the left always like to misconstrue that as being Nazism or fascism. We want a hardline conservative government which will implement a conservative agenda. Now, Andrew Bolt has written about this in the Telegraph. He's become a bit disillusioned about Tony Abbott and some of the policies that he's announced. He's calling it Labor light. And I have to admit that I'm a little bit upset about that as well, because we've had experiments with Labor light, Liberal light and that sort of thing. The most glaring example of a Liberal government doing this sort of thing was the Fraser government, undoubtedly the worst government in our history. They followed the Whitlam government, and they were trying to out-Whitlam Whitlam. I mean, they were doing all of this stuff. The Fraser government was more left-wing than the Whitlam government, and they kept the Whitlam thing going for 7 more years. And when the Hawke government came in, they moved things to the right. You know, they brought in a lot of policies which were conservative policies, like deregulation of the financial sector, floating the dollar, all of those things which greatly benefited our country. They were originally part of the Conservative Manifesto, the agenda of the right, and yet the Fraser government were too gutless to bring it in, and it was left up to Paul Keating to bring it in, and as a result we had the economic boom of the noughties, the decade of the noughties, and that can be put down to Paul Keating's economic reforms. Now, the fact is that what we have now is Tony Abbott with the Me Tooism echoing what the Labor Party are proposing, because he's too scared to frighten the horses. You know, there's this idea that people won't accept conservative policies, that people think that people buck up when they see policies which are too right-wing. And for that we can blame that 1993 election where John Hewson got up with a conservative platform of things that they wanted to do, and they lost the unlosable election, and Paul Keating got back in. And the excuse being given at the time was that the Liberal policies were too right-wing, too conservative. And so ever since then, the Liberals have been too afraid to put forward conservative policies. Well, I really do think that should stop, because we've had soft left policies for ages now, and they've failed. I mean, they call them middle of the road policies, but they are soft left policies. So, some of them hardline left policies, like the policies which have been pushed by the Greens with all this environmental BS and carbon tax and climate change and all of that. You know, that was an agenda that Julia Gillard didn't want. You know, she got up in the election campaign in 2010 and said, there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. And she was forced to bring in the carbon tax when the Greens won the balance of power in the Senate, and they won one lower house seat. Now, about Tony Abbott, I'm a bit reluctant to criticise him in this video, because I, like the vast majority of people, desperately want a change of government. We want to wipe the slate clean and get Labor out of our lives forever. But I'm going to say here that a lot of these policies that Tony Abbott still has, are policies that he took to previous elections to try and appear more human, to try and appear less hardline. For example, that parental leave scheme. That was a scheme that he invented to try and appeal to women, because the tag that the Fairfax Press and the ABC and the left used to use for Tony Abbott was that he had a problem with women. That was the phrase that was being used. And that sort of thing was compounded by Julia Gillard's misogyny speech. Well, actually, that Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, it backfired badly, because after she made that speech, Tony Abbott experienced a huge surge in popularity. You know, that people were just repulsed by that misogyny speech and that sexism garbage and trying to divide the community along sexist lines. People didn't want that. But anyway, Tony Abbott had this paid parental leave scheme. Now, this is just an extension of that middle class welfare, that awful middle class welfare that the Howard government brought in, which was just straight out pork barrelling. It was just throwing money at favoured people, families, you know, all these people who he wanted votes from, Howard and Costello. They brought in this middle class welfare as a form of pork barrelling. Quite simple. Now, he has to get rid of that scheme. The first thing he should do after the election or during the election campaign is say, we're not going ahead with that scheme. The era of middle class welfare is over. And talking about middle class welfare, I have to compliment the Labor government, Wayne Swan, for scrapping the baby bonus. Now, that baby bonus was just disgusting. It was probably the most disgraceful policy that any government had ever brought in. This idea of you know, paying men to stick their prick up some female's pussy. I mean, that just sort of thing is just abhorrent. You know, this idea that, you know, and Peter Costello getting up and saying, have one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country. I almost vomited when he said that. And this idea of shoveling out government funds for people just for having a baby. And the other middle class welfare as well, education tax rebate, childcare rebate, all of this crap that was brought in by Howard and Costello as part of their idea of promoting families and appealing to families. That again was just pork barrelling for the the Howard battlers who saved the government, the Howard government, in the 1998 election. Now, thankfully, and what Tony Abbott has done, he has said that he will keep all of those cuts. Now, the Labor government, Gillard and Swan did Tony Abbott a great favour by cutting all of that out, because in the Liberal Party there was a lot of support for that middle class welfare. They saw it as a policy of the Howard government, and they held it sacrosanct for years. You know, when the Labor government cut back the baby bonus and means tested it and everything, Malcolm Turnbull got up and talked about the politics of envy and all of that. And the Labor government axed that, and I say good on the Labor government. We have to axe this middle class welfare, and we have to do all of these things with the new government that's coming into office. We have to just put a broom through the whole of Labor's program. We just have to throw it out, just out the back door, and have a fresh start with a new government, with a new ideas, conservative ideas on the right, rather than soft left garbage, rather than this nonsense we've had over the past 5 years. Okay, that's about it for this election talk. I'll be back with another election talk sometime down the line. Goodbye.